I was 13 and my mom and her 6-year boyfriend had just separated due to an extensive drug addiction on his part. They constantly fought whenever they were around each other, and things got pretty violent most of the time. There was constant physical and mental abuse. His drug addiction had gotten so bad that when we came home one day we found that he had pawned off our furniture, television, and bedroom sets for drug money. Eventually, he ended up being caught driving under the influence and was sentenced to prison. My mother thought it would be best to move my 9-year-old brother and I into my grandmother's house, as ours was being foreclosed. She couldn't make the rent without her ex's income. That being said, I didn't protest the move. I actually ended up getting better sleep in my grandma's house since I was never awoken by any screaming. However, if I had known then what I do today, I would have not slept at all. My grandma was a very selfless person, and she would have done anything for my mom, my brother, and I. She didn't have much money at all, as she wasn't able to get a job due to intensive knee injuries she received in a car accident years before this. Her boyfriend Louis, however, seemed to be the breadwinner. He kept the bills paid, and he came and went as he pleased. He wasn't the friendliest of people, and boy, was he lazy and sloppy. He always gave me a weird vibe. In this 3-bedroom house lived my mother, grandmother, Louis, my 2 aunts, and my brother and I. It was a full house, so to say. My brother and I shared a pull-out couch in the living room, while my mother slept on a couch adjacent to us. Our move into the house occurred during summer vacation, so me and my brother always looked for something to do. On occasion, Louis would take my brother to the nature trail by our house, and they'd go fishing. He had been recently laid off from his job, so in the time he didn't spend watching TV in his tighty-whitey underpants, asleep, or cooking himself enough food to feed 7 armies. He actually felt like partaking in some physical activity. I usually stayed behind, as I didn't really care about fishing at the time, and I didn't particularly like him. One day I was using the bathroom, and I dropped the toilet paper roll off the ring. I bent down to pick it up and noticed a stash of books against the cupboard. I reached and grabbed out more than a dozen pornographic books. Quite obviously, they were Louis'. I panicked and told my mom what I had found, because for some reason in my mind, I thought he would somehow realize that they were moved from their spot. When my mom politely confronted him about this, he became belligerent. It escalated into a fight that resulted in him leaving for several days. When he returned, he became very violent towards everyone, especially my mother and her 2 sisters. On top of this, my mother had been storing all of our stuff, well, what was left of it, down in their basement. She took notice that a $1,000 power saw that once belonged to her ex had gone missing. Her ex wasn't able to pawn that off, simply because he didn't know about it yet. It was hidden in the garage, and it was meant to be a birthday present for him. Anyway, she wasn't sure if the neighbors had taken it. It was a duplex, but she did suspect Louis. She already didn't like him due to his laziness, his nasty porn stash, and his growing attitude towards everyone in the house. She banned him from taking my brother on fishing trips, and also began encouraging my grandma to break up with him. My grandma still decided to keep him around, even though he started becoming very violent towards her as well. This all changed when my mom saw her power saw in the window of a pawn shop. It had the same exact serial number that she had on the warranty papers. She asked the pawn shop who had sold the saw, and their description fit Louis perfectly. That was the final straw. My mom took charge and moved his things out. He became belligerent once again, and we ended up calling the cops and reporting domestic violence. My mom explained the situation to the cops, and they had him gather all his belongings and leave the house. What we found out the next day still sends shivers down my spine. Louis was a recovering cocaine addict who had relapsed, and badly. He failed a drug test, so he actually lost his job as opposed to being laid off. He moved into a tiny apartment complex soon after, and finally stopped coming by the house and begging for our forgiveness. My mom was not having it. Months went by and we had all forgotten about what had happened until my grandma and my mom saw something on the news that stopped their hearts for a moment. a New York man was arrested for the murder of a Florida woman. The mugshot appeared on the screen. It was Louis. Not only was he a drug addict, but he was a killer. Apparently, he met the woman right after everything went down with my grandma, and a few months later he moved with her to Florida, where she was originally from. When the woman went missing, all of her family members pointed fingers at him. They said he seemed crazy at times, and that he was very violent and aggressive towards her. They claimed they had urged her many times to break up with him, but she felt terrible that he was laid off and had moved all his stuff all the way to Florida with her, so she refused. Finally, Louis snapped and strangled the poor woman dead in her own home. He made up a lot of stories during his testimonies about what really happened. On one testimony, he suggested that the woman might have died during rough sex that included strangulation. What the fuck? When she was dead, he cut up her body into several pieces, presumably with an axe, put them in a tarp, and stashed them in the trunk of her own car. He drove said car with the body inside to a storage garage in Wisconsin and left it there several months before he was finally discovered. When this woman went missing, the family pointed fingers at Louis and a search went out for him. He was finally tracked down in Wisconsin and arrested. He was proven guilty of second-degree murder and other charges such as grand theft auto. He was sentenced to life in prison, and to this day he rots in there. I can't imagine what would have happened if my mom hadn't been so adamant about my grandma kicking him out. He was truly crazy. My mom, aunts, and grandma, or I easily could have been in the place of that poor woman, or even my poor brother. I later learned on those fishing trips, he would get high on coke and drive my little brother around whilst doing so. Easily the creepiest thing I've ever been through. As a teenager, I waited tables in my local restaurant to pay for gas for my car. I met Mr. Creep there. In my naive mind, he seemed normal at first, despite the fact that he was 20 and wanted to date a 17-year-old. Leaving my job after dark scared me, so I taught myself to get into my car, shut the door, and lock it in one fluid motion. It made me feel safe. One night, I was leaving work and had just gotten into my car when Mr. Creep seemed to just appear out of nowhere, yanking my door handle and trying to open it. I looked into his eyes for a split second before he smiled, and what I saw absolutely chilled me to my bones. I don't know how to describe the evil I saw. From then on, I was terrified of him, but I didn't let on because I was afraid of what he might do if I told him I never wanted to see him again. After this, he constantly lied to try to impress me and tried to invent ways of being alone with me, but my instinct was to run, so I avoided him. About 2 weeks after the incident, the restaurant got robbed and there was significant evidence against Mr. Creep, just not the kind that allowed the cops to charge him. I sent all my texts and conversations with Mr. Creep to the police chief in hopes it would help. Mr. Creep slithered away after that, but I always looked over my shoulder. About 5 years ago, he messaged me on Facebook out of the blue. He went on about this top secret military clearance as well as a huge acreage he owned. It made me nervous, and it felt like he was trying to spring a trap or something, but I tried to put it out of mind. Then today I was looking through posts about unsolved murders when I saw his mugshot. He is now facing murder charges as well as 2 other violent felony charges. I am so glad to know that he's locked up, but so overwhelmed about how correct my instincts about Mr. Creep were. I feel like I escaped him. When I was an angsty teenager, I moved in with my mother and stepdad to escape a less than desirable situation. Because of the move, I was enrolled into a new school. This school was located in one of the sketchiest neighborhoods in the city. Everyone who resided in the area was relatively low income, my family included. We had a rec center near the school that was a hotspot for, let's call them undesirables, which was primarily teenage boys wandering over from the nearby school to catcall the girls. Lunchtime was my favorite. I loved going outside for chow and having sweaty teenage boys asking me for the nasty. Note the sarcasm. During my time at that shitty school, I made an array of friends. However, there was this one person who became my best friend. Let's call her Blondie. She and I got along like, what's a negative connotation? I was a people pleaser, and she took advantage of that. Blondie was nice enough, but she was problematic. Regardless, we were fast friends, and thus began our very short-lived friendship. Over the school year, she mainly came over to my house. Since I was the only child, we usually had the house to ourselves while my folks were at work. However, she finally invited me to her house around the middle of the school year. I was super excited. I had always wanted to meet her family since they were always such an enigma. Blondie wasn't one to divulge information about her home life. All I knew is that she lived with her mother, stepdad, and a younger sibling. I'm unsure if she was embarrassed or didn't care to share. But I finally had the honor of meeting them. Honestly, her family was amazing. They were kind and treated me very well. Not to mention, her stepdad was a phenomenal cook. The best spaghetti and meatballs I've ever had. After that, I started going to her house more and more. I really enjoyed it. Fast forward to a month or two before the end of school year, and it's Blondie's birthday. Her family was throwing a little get-together at her house, and I was invited. Blondie and I headed out to her house after school, and it was a really fun time, until near the end of the day. Now, I know next to nothing about her biological father. I knew he wasn't really in the picture. He'd sometimes drop by to say hello, but I never personally met him. That was until he made a surprise visit to give Blondie a present. When I tell you there's a shift in the atmosphere, I kid you not, I could immediately feel it, and I was a dumb kid. We were in the living room eating some cake, and there was a knock on the front door. Blondie's mom answered, and her face, which once had a smile, turned into a scowl. If looks could kill, the dude would be dead. She moved aside, and this man walked in. I'll never forget how everyone in the room got tense, except for Blondie, who excitedly greeted her dad. At the time, he seemed like a normal-ish dude, maybe a tad bit on the creepier side, but who am I to judge? Blondie introduced me to her father, and we shared some pleasantries. At one point, I was invited to get some ice cream with them the following day, which I accepted. I mean, I was getting free ice cream. Of course I was going to say yes. He eventually left, and we all got back to eating cake. I had honestly forgotten about the visceral reaction everyone had upon seeing him. Maybe if I remembered, I would have said no. Anyway, the following day rolled around, and I went for ice cream with Blondie and her dad. I can't remember much from that day, other than him asking me if I had a boyfriend or girlfriend, which seemed innocent enough, but the way he asked it made me feel weird. I honestly can't remember much from my other encounters with this man. Nothing really jumps out to me. I know I went out with him and Blondie a few more times before my family moved to another city and we lost touch. Fast forward a few years and I'm attending college. I'd managed to stay in contact with one person from my middle school days. Let's call her Teddy. She reached out to me one day asking if I wanted to go see a movie, which I happily accepted. I took the train to a nearby mall, and Teddy and I watched a movie. After, we headed to the food court and got some chow. We were catching up. It had been a couple years since we last saw each other, when Teddy suddenly perked up. She asked me if I heard about Blondie's father, to which I said we hadn't been in contact since I moved. Teddy's face lit up, and she told me the most mind-blowing story my little brain had ever heard. She informed me that Blondie's father had murdered a woman. Now, before I continue, she was going based on word of mouth when she was telling me all the details. Teddy had no news articles or police reports to back her story. She was told by a friend who heard it from someone else, but what she told me wasn't far from the actual truth. According to her, Blondie's father had taken the life of a street worker. He had gotten away with it for 2 years, and his truck got him caught. Apparently, there was something unique about it. Teddy couldn't tell me much more because she generally didn't know. I remember going back to my dorm and trying to Google for more details, but I couldn't find a damn thing about it. I eventually forgot about the story until last year. I was discussing the craziest stories from my life with a friend when suddenly I remembered Teddy's story. After some digging, I finally found an article that described the crime. I clicked on it, and when I saw the picture of the man, well, words couldn't describe what I felt. Everything Teddy told me was true, but it was so much worse than what she and I thought. Out of respect for the victim and her family, I won't describe what he did, but he was arrested 3 years after her life had been taken. I can't find any information about how he was caught, but it had something to do with his truck. He was charged with manslaughter. He took a plea bargain, an indignity to a body, and only served 7 years of his 14-year sentence. He had served half already because he was in custody during the trial. I looked him up not too long ago, and I learned some unsettling information which prompted me to write this post. He was released from prison a few months ago. Guess what he did? He killed another woman. From what I've read, it had similarities to the other murder he committed. This time around, he was charged with second-degree murder and indignity to a body. There's, unfortunately, still not a lot of information about the second woman, but both victims were mothers. They both were cruelly taken from this world, and I still can't wrap my mind around all this. I met this monster. I was best friends with his daughter. I don't think I was personally in any danger, but the fact that I met someone capable of such a heinous crime, it scares the living shit out of me. I can't even begin to imagine how Blondie must have felt after learning of her father's crimes. Anyway, I apologize for the length of the story and how vague I was regarding the crimes. I know some of you really want to know everything, but it didn't feel right to share their story, especially since it had little to do with me. I'm just some schmuck that was friends with the daughter.